Hi there, hope you're well. Lots of you enjoyed the last episode I did with this particular co-host. Today I'm talking with Emma McDermott again. The last time Emma and I talked, it was back in July on episode 10. The title was Being Curious About Yourself. Today, Emma and I talk about the word trigger and how, by talking only about what triggers us in our lives, we are only actually acknowledging just one part of the weapon which brings people down. By only talking about the triggers, we miss an opportunity to explore the rest of the gun, so to speak. Well, I hope you enjoy the conversation. You're listening to This Won't Fix You. I'm your host, Nadine Pittam, and this show is a curation of interesting models, metaphors and images discovered or manifested through my work as an accredited psychotherapist. You can expect to hear nifty ideas, clever language and thought-provoking ways of looking at life. Each episode, you'll get one of two alternating perspectives. First, a conversation which introduces and discusses the theory or idea, and we call this the A side, and then the B side, which, while not therapy, is a deeper exploration of that theory or idea from a more therapeutic standpoint. Hello everybody. I'm actually nervous about this episode. I'm joined by Emma McDermott again. Emma, hello.
Hi Nadine, nice to be with you this morning, even though we've had a bit of a turbulent start to this, talking about triggers.
Oh yeah, I suppose I should introduce the subject is triggers, and there's a metaphor that I want to read first of all before we start. But I'm nervous because I feel like what we're going to say today could potentially be quite controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about kind of how that goes. Anyway, the quote is from, or the metaphor that we're using is from one of my favourite books, The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. I think it's now out in paperback, and it's available in most public libraries too, I believe. Anyway, the metaphor is, the word trigger is itself a major clue. It has become something of a rhetorical cannonball, hurled back and forth by opposite sides in many a debate or confrontation, rarely deepening conversations and often ending them. Yet, on closer examination, it has much to teach us about ourselves. Consider, how big a part of a weapon is the trigger? Minuscule, really, perhaps the smallest visible component. The weapon also bears ammunition, explosive material, often a guidance system, and mechanisms for delivering the payload to its target with the desired force. If, when triggered, we focus our ire only on the external stimuli that set us off, we miss a golden opportunity to examine what ammunition and explosive charges we ourselves have been packing since childhood. Emma, you chose this one. You liked this one. This piqued your interest.
It did pique my interest, and I think what made me choose this one was often when people start at the beginning of the therapeutic process, anxiety is one of the overriding feelings, and feeling triggered a lot of the time is often what I hear in my little office or online from people that are suffering and that do turn up to therapy in the hope that something could change around this. And I think on that process, or from that starting position of feeling very anxious and triggered all the time or upset all the time, there can be a real yearning for wanting somebody else to answer these questions, wanting confirmation as to whether they're right or they're wrong, or their gut feelings are telling them something to trust or mistrust. So I just think as therapists, it's part of the everyday with what we deal with. And I suppose in my practice, I've had a different relationship with that word even, and to where I've landed now and to how I work in that space, I suppose. So I think that's why I picked the word triggers, because it is so commonplace in the mental health discourse and what I hear, and in my own practice, how I receive that information, I suppose, how I work with that as well.
So you're saying that your relationship to it has changed?
Yes.
Because it is, you said it's in the mental health discourse. It absolutely is. And I think that there are several different sort of interpretations of what it is. And I think Gabor Mate's metaphor really, for me, highlights what's helpful about thinking about things in terms of trigger and what's not helpful about thinking about things in terms of triggers. And he's basically saying that the trigger is an invitation to explore something. So if we are triggered, if we are, you use the word anxious, so if we are feeling anxious about something, then that is a trigger that is an invitation to look deeply at something that needs a little bit of healing, for want of a better word.
Yeah. And I think that there's so many layers to that, because the trigger is on the outside of the mechanism, and it's the first touch that sets off the rest of the cogs and the actions and the explosions. So I think sometimes a nice place to start with triggers is just thinking about what other factors make the problem more or less likely to occur. And if we were talking about that in CBT language, those are called like modifiers. So let me give you some examples of
Let's do it.
Modifiers. So if you are, let's use something that's kind of relevant to a lot of people when they do exams. If you are anxious about doing a test, whether it be your driving test or a GCSE or something to do with work, and you're going in there and you feel like you're familiar with the space, you are familiar with the teachers or the people that are working the exam, whether your relationship with the subject matter is you feel confident in that, you've had good or bad experiences in the past with similar material, you're not tired, you're not tense, you've gone into that feeling relatively prepared, then you kind of, the context, the situation, the things that could trigger you, or that, because it is a triggering situation, you've mediated or you've worked with other modifiers that could help you hold the line with, not comfort, because I don't think you could ever be comfortable in that situation, but tolerating those stresses. But say, for example, you're in a different situation. Say, for example, you're going to a family do and you've had an argument with one of your relatives there. You're feeling vulnerable because you've drank some alcohol, you're recalling the last conversation or argument that you had, that you are, the social interactions, they're there with your friends, you're there on your own. I think sometimes there's so much richness on the surface level of understanding our triggers that can be sometimes a nice place to start, because sometimes we've got agency over these things. And I think that can be, meeting somebody at the surface level of the triggers can be just an easy way in, I suppose, of trying to understand how we feel so vulnerable in certain situations and what we can actually do to prepare ourselves, modify that, sit with that, challenge these ideas. Am I making sense? I'm gone off on a
Yeah, because I liked what you said about the trigger being the external part, and that there's so much that goes on internally. And so it is definitely about making sure that we are aware of all the things that are inside us that are actually probably very little to do with anybody's intent on the outside. And you're talking in the example about going to a party, and you maybe had a row with a relative or something, that you can choose to ignore, to avoid going to the party. We can choose to not engage with that relative, or indeed the whole family. We can shut things down, and that happens, doesn't it, in families all the time.
Yeah.
Some people, oh, well, my sister's not talking to my brother, and people shut these doors then, and they bring up the drawbridge because it's too painful. But actually, again, that is avoiding the situation, isn't it? And so you're saying in therapy we can start to dip toes in the water as to what are the things that are upsetting us, which then leads us to investigate more what's going on inside us. Because trauma isn't the thing that happens to us. It's what happens inside us as a result. And so in that example with the family, when at the family party, that we would, as therapists, perhaps invite that person to think about what's going on inside them, what are all the narratives they're building around that.
Yeah, I think so. And I like that around understanding the narratives. But then I think that the next step on from that is, and what position can we take once we understand that for ourselves? Is it that we sit this one out? Is it that we turn up to these parties with a friend and feel like we've got an ally? Is it that we make some phone calls beforehand and try and, soften the situation? And I think those lines of inquiry are really a lot of what we spend time in therapy doing is just thought experiments. Where's the wriggle room? Where is the kind, the generous, the gentle next step that might feel uncomfortable, but gives us at least this idea that we can move from the position that we feel quite stuck in.
Right, I get it. So you're talking about encouraging the person who's sitting in front of you who's worried about going to the party. You're talking about maybe encouraging them to think about strategies, I suppose, that they can employ that make the ultimate arriving at the party stress, make that smaller in advance of, like you said, taking a friend or making a phone call in advance, definitely saying I'm staying for an hour and that's all, and then I'm leaving. That's what you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah. And I think so.
Do you know, it's reminding me... Oh, sorry, were you going to say something? Sorry.
No, carry on.
No, it reminds me of a quote I heard at some point by a woman called Susan David, and she says, discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. And so if we take that party example, then going to the party and working through whatever it is that's distressing you could arguably make for more meaningful connections with family, or certainly more meaningful exploration of ourselves and what it is that's upsetting us inside. Because maybe there's something that an auntie, for instance, had said to us that made us anxious, but actually our response is nothing to do with the auntie. Maybe the auntie just very, very lightly touched upon something that is really distressing for us because of something somebody else did or said years and years ago, and that's actually our responsibility to deal with, not the auntie's. And so we are facing the discomfort. We're trying to minimise the degree of discomfort, is what you're saying, but we're still going in to the situation expecting discomfort, but expecting a kind of agility around that.
Yeah. And I think that the words like agility, adaptation, of bravery, of not feeling like life shrinks because of the challenges, because of these triggers, changes the relationship that we can have with ourselves. Not that there's a magical wand that's waved and everything moves on and there's harmony within families, because you've braved a
in whose world?
But that you have challenged yourself and you've not got stuck in the narrative, that you are not living in a place of fear, and that's it. And that's kind of, you have got it's become rigid and it's become really stuck, that you can experiment with these thoughts, ideas, expectations. Because I think we often feel like we can use our past and look through this crystal ball and say, I know what will happen. I'll turn up. My sister will have had a drink. She'll send her partner over and I'll feel under attack from the second I get there. And then my mum will say something. And then, you feel like you can almost, especially in therapy, give the therapist the full breakdown of, what to expect, the crystal ball of it all, because probably these things have happened in snippets, or, it feels like a well-trodden neural pathway in your head. But it's hard, isn't it, to think, well, that might happen, but I won't know until I go. I won't know until I try things out. And maybe there is, like you said, a nice conversation with an aunt that you've not seen for a while, or a connection with a cousin, or a compliment, or something else in the mix for you that is just difficult to get to if we're just shrinking our life because we're living our life with fear in the driving seat or upset in the driving seat, and we feel very protective and defensive of ourselves.
Yeah, I can have compassion for us all in that situation. The kind of the urge to crawl into a space of victim and to kind of cozy up with an enormous duvet and just go, no, that's just too painful. I'm not going to do that. But something in that is to shirk responsibility, isn't it? Something in that is to what do I mean? It's to withdraw from life. It's to shirk responsibility maybe for the resolution or the growth or the healing or the moving on from. But I think it's also to hide from life, isn't it?
Yeah. And I wonder though whether the hide from life is also the miss the opportunity or to shrink away from the opportunity to say something that challenges the status quo, or
Right.
the confrontational element of it,
Absolutely.
Because if you do have an experience when you can say to somebody else, that really hurts me when you say things like that, or I wish you wouldn't, just, I wish you wouldn't, for me this feels like I'm under attack, I wish you could understand things differently. Might not be the time to talk about things, but I've come today to show up. There's just opportunities for confrontation, and I think that if we're very aware of our triggers, confrontation can feel like conflict, but sometimes confrontation is, getting that opportunity to speak up, speak from our perspective, to say something meaningful for how we're experiencing things. And I think confrontation and conflict get really sort of knotted together and almost come with a negativity or a bad press.
Yeah, and it's inevitable, isn't it, that we are going to be in conflict. I love that. I kind of want to edge us forward into another area at the moment where you're talking about other people, the role of other people in these conflicts. So I kind of see it like I am not a scientist, I am not a chemist, but if we see it all, we're all kind of like little molecules all floating around and sort of bashing up against each other, kind of gently sometimes and sometimes a little bit more explosively. But we've all got our own little chemical kind of makeup. Mm-hmm. And as we're floating around in the ether, we bump into other people who have their chemical makeup. And we can't expect other people to not bump into us. And we can't expect other people to change their chemical makeup just so that we don't have a little explosion, so to speak. But how much more productive it is to say, all right, this is my chemical makeup. I really struggle when you speak like this to me. This is taking responsibility then, isn't it? I really struggle when you talk to me in that way. And so I'm just going to use a metaphor that I talked about in episode 1. I'm just going to stick a flag in that. I find that difficult when you do that. Now, if you choose to continue to talk to me in that way, then I have to make a decision based on your behaviour. But all we can do is just gently bump into one another and share with each other our own perspectives and the impact that things are having, and hope that other people have the capacity to adapt and subtly change so that the way that we bump into each other is less explosive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if you break down what you're doing there when we are banging up against each other, is we are using our words, being expressive, we are speaking from our perspective and owning our stuff, like you say, putting a flag in it, but also braving the communication with that. And I think that opportunity to experiment with these words in therapy is really useful. I think it's really helpful also to recognise that maybe as a child, when you're experiencing the full thrust of family dynamics and feeling less empowered and feeling quite small or overlooked or voiceless, there's something very meaningful that changes as an adult that we can sometimes get to grips with in therapy, of our words, our voice, our communication, the practice to couch things, of of really understanding ourselves. And I think that is the key to a lot of transformation, empowerment, feeling like change is possible, is that self-awareness, but not just the self-awareness, the words and the communication and the process that can develop around that. Now, this doesn't happen overnight, does it? It's just every part of that is really important. And understanding ourselves and our molecules as we grow and we change and we adapt and we change shape because of the environment that we work in is a beautiful and powerful thing, and how enriching life is when we've got access to those words, to that understanding, to those situations to practice and fuck it up, get it wrong, say, actually, I'm so fucking angry with you. And you can burn through that with your therapist and then get to the bit that's underneath it, you know.
That's a great idea. I like the notion of burning through something with your therapist, kind of getting rid of taking the heat out of something so that you can get to maybe the hurt that sits underneath it. And then you can make a decision about whether that hurt is something that the other person deserves to hear and has the capacity to respond to, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about adult and child, aren't you? You're talking about the child responds kind of impulsively, reflexively, whereas the adult has the capacity to step back. It is a privileged position, isn't it, to be able to step back and think about, pause, take into account lots of different perspectives, but still remain grounded in our own experience.
Yes, it is. I feel quite overwhelmed even talking about it now. Like, it's quite exciting to have all of those possibilities, you know. It's almost like it's too powerful to hold. This idea of the doors that could open, the things that could change, the ways that you can move and grow in the world, how you can love differently because of all these things. You know, it's really powerful and moving.
I am absolutely there with you, although not in your world. Obviously, I've got my own rich world going on in my head, and presumably people listening will too, that I can relate this to my own experiences. I think for me, and maybe this is the controversial element, is to what extent, and I think there is a tendency in a certain faction of society, that's suggesting it's like a certain demographic, I don't mean that, but I think there are some people that interpret this concept of trigger in a way that then requires other people to avoid triggering, that we then require other people to change their behaviour to an unreasonable degree. So there's a story that I'd like to share. This is not my story, it's nobody in my life specifically, but there's somebody I know who has a niece who's just been diagnosed with autism. And there was a big family party planned, and so there were going to be 10 or so people around the dinner table. And because of this recent diagnosis for this, I think she's about 12, for this 12-year-old, the mother of the 12-year-old had sent a message around the rest of the family saying, right, because my daughter has this autism diagnosis, loud noises trigger her. So what I'd like is for everybody to not laugh loudly. I'd like for everybody to talk very quietly. I'd like for nobody to mention this subject, and this subject, because these things are upsetting to her. And so she's kind of then like micromanaging how the whole social event's going to go in order to protect the daughter. And I think that this feels very controversial. I can already feel my heart rate's kind of rising a little bit, because what I'm not saying is that we shouldn't have compassion for people and make allowances for people who have a divergence or any kind of disability that means that accessing a kind of social situation is difficult. I think it's the degree, it's the reasonableness, how okay it is, how okay it's not to require of other people such limiting parameters.
Because when you come together, does that kind of eradicate the opportunity for bonding, for joyful moments, for laughter, for just the unpredictableness of life that if we can tolerate or move closer to and doesn't feel like it's always baked with fear or associated with fear, does that provide different vantage points for trust, for experience? Does it allow us to to not live a smaller life, but to live a life that we know ourselves, we know that we can retreat when we want to, but sometimes it's interesting to step towards things. Sometimes, there is different situations where we can experiment with these things, and we don't have to feel like everything is scaled as a threat, overwhelming, too much, that there's nuance in every situation.
That's interesting, because you're essentially talking about the way that certain therapies, almost all therapies actually, heal trauma, and that is through exposure of sorts, isn't it? We've got to be careful here, and I think maybe now would be an ideal time to articulate the difference between the kind of where the word triggered came from in terms of a response to trauma and a re-experiencing of trauma. And what we've been talking about so far is the kind of more colloquial understanding of triggering, where basically we've just got a painful memory or a painful experience, and we're being triggered, in inverted commas, to feel discomfort. But actually the word trigger comes from a kind of a much more precise and specific response to trauma, where somebody is re-experiencing a traumatic moment. The typical example being the war veteran who hears a car backfire or a plane go overhead, and immediately then, like, time disappears and they are transported back to that moment of trauma. And we've been talking today more about the kind of colloquial understanding of triggering, haven't we? But what you're saying at the start, if I just go back to what I think you were trying to say, is that we're talking about building resilience. We're talking about an exposure. And there is actually a thing called exposure therapy, of course, where we do gently and within a window of tolerance, so to speak, expose ourselves or the client to, in inverted commas, traumatic experience, but in a way that stops the trauma being relived, in a way that just makes it something that we can begin to process. I'm thinking about certain CBT techniques use exposure therapy. I'm thinking about EMDR, eye movement, desensitizing and reprocessing therapy, where what we're doing is we're trying to take the emotional weight away from the memory so that it becomes just a memory instead of a something like a portal to a previous time.
Yes, yeah. And all of the, the severity of triggers, because like you said, you've got the flashbacks there that are visceral, that really remove that person and they become disassociated and locked into that re-experiencing thing of the trauma, versus the negotiations that happen because there's upset, there's urges, there's shame, there's all these other things. It does sit on a very large spectrum of, what we're talking about here, and the severity of the experience is a guide to how we work with that or don't work with that, and what our limitations are as well with therapists, because an intensive trauma therapy for very severe flashbacks is different from, coming to see me and talking about these other things that is, involve your family, that are talking about urges to do with recovery and how we manage those triggers. It requires sensitivity, and it requires that real sort of exploration and inquiry of, where are we here? How does this affect your life? Is this kind of taking you to a place of real deep depression and locked in an anxiety that means you can't overcome it? Or are we talking about other things here where there is movement? And I'm not saying that people that are experiencing flashbacks are locked in that situation forever. It's just, maybe there's different courses of treatment, or there's different ways of looking that have more intensity on different experiences related to flashbacks, triggers, and those more colloquial terms, or the things that we've been talking that sit on a different part of that scale.
And you're saying it is both the therapist and the client, or indeed, even if you're not in therapy, just your way of engaging with the world. It's all responsible, everybody's responsibility to pay attention to those, the heightenings, the ratcheting up of anxiety. So the therapist obviously trained to really pay attention to moments where they feel like somebody might be disappearing from them in the therapy room, but the client as well, to kind of almost educate the client, or indeed if you are in the outside world, to educate yourself, not in the therapy room, but to just become familiar with the physiological signs that you are about to sort of separate and dissociate
Yes.
from reality.
Yes. And I think we're also talking about panic there, aren't we? And I think sometimes with therapy we walk this very thin line of working with somebody's raw, unprocessed material and trying to help them resurface at the end so that they can reintegrate into the world, so they can attend to their life and what they need to do. And sometimes that's, one of the most difficult aspects of therapy is you sit in a room with somebody and you talk about and you reveal and you disclose your innermost thoughts, feelings, fears, hopes, dreams, and then you go, boop, out you go an hour later. It's done, and then you just kind of re-emerge to the world almost like with having found something, having revealed something, and there's a vulnerability, and there's a different way of being in the world after that, where you can go to the coffee shop that you usually go but feel like you're a bit of an alien, like, oh, I've just had this most intense conversation in my life and now I'm buying a cup of tea and I'm sat there looking at it like, is the world the same now? is this okay? How do I feel after this?
Because what happens inside isn't always visible on the outside.
Yeah, it is. And I feel a real sort of sense of responsibility, but also creativity and care and empathy to check in the next time. How have you been since the last session? What did you take from the last session? Is there anything that's coming up that's new that we need to kind of work with? Is it okay? Would you want to choose to revisit what we spoke about last time, or do we need to have something in between? Is there something else that's come up that sits within your day-to-day life, so that we are responsibly working with triggers, the past, but also very much holding the present as being important as well.
Right, pacing it, making sure that we're not charging on ahead.
Yeah.
Because I think as therapists we are so used to pain, aren't we? Not necessarily just our own, although that too. And it could potentially be easy to forget somebody else's journey. I remember being on a training course, not the one you and I did, but the psychosexual training that I did, and there was a woman who, in inverted commas, was triggered by something. It's a psychosexual course, lots and lots of potential for people to be triggered, as we're talking around all sorts of issues to do with sexual abuse. And I still don't even know what the thing was that triggered her, but what I remember was, it was on Zoom, this particular training, and she just kind of put her head down on the side of the screen. I could see her, and she's a lovely one. She's now become a friend of mine, but she kind of put her head in her hands, and the tutor, it was only a small group, there were only about 5 of us, and the tutor stopped the session, absolutely, kind of checked in with her. And this woman, she's a therapist, obviously, and she was crying, like not sobbing crying, but she was definitely moved, and she was in difficulty in that moment. And she said, "It's okay, it's only pain." Just absolutely blew my mind that she would articulate it like that. And I think we do as therapists. We live in that world on a day-to-day basis, and we know that pain is survivable. We know that pretty much all emotional pain is not going to kill us. That's part of our training, isn't it? We get poked and prodded, emotionally speaking, constantly through the training, so that we can come out of the other side of the training feeling like we don't have any triggers, or the triggers that we have, we are really, really familiar with. And we have to be really sensitive and remember that what we're working with here is people whose triggers are perhaps disproportionately larger than the rest of their gun, if that makes sense. That they are so easily taken into a moment of pain.
Yes, yeah. And when you slow things down, which is what therapy does as well, and you can hold yourself with that kindness, self-compassion, and say, it's okay, I'll get through this. those are the really beautiful moments of feeling like the silence is a big part of the work, the holding the space and the time that goes with that there's so many unspoken parts that are really significant but difficult to even articulate, and but also really significant of what you've just said there, of just all of how complicated it is, but how simple it is at the same time. It's just that one moment of slowing things down and finding that care for yourself in the silence that you've co-created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the number of times I have myself and invited other people sitting in front of me to just kind of talk to themselves with kindness. It's okay, sweetheart. Almost sort of tapping yourself on the chest or the shoulder. Just, it's okay, yeah, like that woman did on that course. It's only pain. It's okay. And yet, psychologically, it feels like it's going to kill us. But to know that it's not. Like you say, there is something inherently really, really simple about that.
Yeah.
Love that way of looking at it.
And I'm not as, bolstered in my own opinion of myself, because even in my own process and my own experience with therapy, some of my light bulb moments or breakthroughs or whatever we want to call it, or moments of significance and tenderness, have been after or in between my sessions or months later, where I've gone, actually, I can do really difficult things. And I've not realised that until further along on the journey. And I've almost repeated it to myself in various, or reinforced that idea in various conversations, situations, in therapy, where I've gone, oh, fuck yeah, I can do really difficult things. And that's been a personal wow moment for me. A bit, like hearing how your friend dealt with her own pain in that moment. It's only pain. That's a wow moment, isn't it? Really?
It is, absolutely. Yeah, I remember, in fact, I think it was you who said it in our last podcast, the one that we did a few months ago, when you said we cannot live a sanitised life, that we can't expect, like the mother of that 12-year-old who wanted the whole family to change the way that they communicated, we cannot create a world where we are not going to be triggered. That world does not exist. But our comfort within it is about an acceptance of the fact that we are going to be susceptible, and we are going to feel fear, we are going to feel shame, we are going to feel pain. And it's about how we allow ourselves to handle that, to be in that, to work through that, the ebb and flow of it all.
Yeah, it is that. Exactly. I suppose I'm also thinking about how sometimes underneath that is the most vulnerable aspect of ourselves. And I think that's what helps with working with a therapist, and what makes it different than doing it alone, is when you are connecting the dots with triggers and what stories lie behind that. Where you started with this is that underneath that is maybe messages from our childhood, and if we are connected, or the trigger is related in maybe even a dotted line or a swirly line, not even necessarily a straight line, because it never is a straight line, to some of the ideas of I'm not lovable, I'm of no value, I have been misunderstood too many times. And there's that aspect that connects to protectionism. We are in relationship with that. And I think what we were talking about a little bit earlier, because I've gone back to that place, is how much sensitivity is needed around that, and how much we can go in layers with triggers. Because if we stay at the top and we stay in that polarized view that is in the media a bit of, oh, young people, all they talk about is their triggers, their snowflakes, we're this, they're that, we could really miss the gold, or we could really miss the things that come out when we don't want to speak, when we have spent some time with things and we're curious and we make inquiries and we feel safe enough to go to those places.
You're saying that's one extreme. I love that we're missing the gold. If we just accuse people of being snowflakes, of being vulnerable, we're missing something. You kind of suggested a scale as well, like we're almost going to go to the other end then, of where we're expecting everybody in life to shut down in order to protect our snowflakeness. So what you're saying is we need somewhere in the middle that's a bit more inquiry-based. In fact, it's not even in the middle. It's a whole new point, isn't it, on the triangle, that we're actually looking for, inquiry, curiosity. I think there's, I don't know whether you even use the word compassion, but to find a place where we have compassion that just because we're having these experiences and because we are upset by something or feeling pain as a result of something somebody said, that doesn't make us a snowflake. And we're not broken because we have feelings, that our feelings are data. That's why they're there, that they're just data for us. We're not broken for having that. And to have a certain, arguably, generation, maybe, of people accuse us another generation, because it does seem to be a kind of generational thing. It is an attack. The word snowflake is a pejorative attack, isn't it, on a certain demographic, really, of people who are aware of what hurts them. But I absolutely agree that there is gold then in the investigation of that. And we have to carry with us some compassion on that journey that says, yeah, you're not broken. You're just having feelings. And that's okay. And it's human and it's reasonable. It's even predictable.
What a lovely way to hold yourself with such generosity and understanding. And if you can hold that gold in your own purse, in your own little heart, then the reaction to a relative that is in a different generation, that hasn't had space, time, opportunity for self-inquiry, that might go, bloody hell, you're all the same, how can I can't say anything these days without getting in trouble, almost that can bounce off you because you've got that for yourself and you can understand their limitations as well, and that you're not in that constant seeking maybe outside of yourself for we all, that's bollocks. We're all looking for reassurance and understanding in other people, but in the real world, we're not guaranteed it, are we? We're not guaranteed to be understood. We might even be criticised, or our therapy language be used against us in family situations. Here she comes with her big words. Here she comes standing up for every man, watch out what you say, because she'll read your mind. She'll throw some, weapon of social justice at you. And, it's, and you've just got to be realistic, thinking that's, we can do this work, we can have these insights, but it's not translatable to every situation, in every relationship, everywhere.
I absolutely love that. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Here she comes. I've certainly had that.
Yeah.
Don't you therapize me.
Yeah. Or they look at you like, this is my kids like squinting at me. Oh, am I in a therapy session now? And then, just go about doing whatever they want in a carefree way, because I'm their mum. So it's, and isn't humour a really nice part of maybe finding an in-between space of what you value, how you can talk about things, and how you understand that it's not the same for everybody, that you can, after maybe a bit of time and some of the sharper feelings have dissipated, laugh and hold it a bit lighter as well, and think, I do occupy that space with self-awareness, different language, emotional understanding, but I can also see it from other people's perspective. I can also hold myself a bit lighter and, laugh at my own idiosyncrasies.
Worthiness.
Worthiness. That's a good one.
You're hand-wringing, as they say.
Yeah.
You're talking again, as you so often do. You talk so well about the messiness of life, and the kind of the massive space in between the binaries of of rigidity, of holding on to who we think we are, and the kind of believing that we're better than other people because we've got some kind of insight, some kind of knowledge. You're so good at seeing the absolute tangle then that sits in between us as people, as we try and navigate our differences that sometimes feel insurmountably different, but they're not, because you're saying if the one thing that we share is fucked up, messy, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to say things that seem a little conceited. If that is our common ground, then that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place to meet other people, isn't it? Because then whatever comes, we can just come back to that mess in the middle and just kind of sit in the swamp covered in mud and grass. And go, yeah, me too.
Yeah, and you can laugh at the other person and you can laugh at yourself because it is ridiculous. It's also a big bridge between you. It is a place of growth and beauty. And yeah.
You said that laughing. Why is growth and beauty worthy of laughter?
In a swamp situation, it is. I've got visions of you kind of like covered in the, swamp juice with maybe a bit of a tuft of soil on your head or a flower or something, and just how ridiculous it is, but how, funny and beautiful it is at the same time, how it kind of shows our similarities and not our differences, and our, I suppose, both of us wanting to be seen and understood. Because I think what goes wrong in a lot of relationships and where triggers are involved is misunderstanding. And I think that saying things from that personal perspective and how you feel about things, and trying to find the language to build bridges between people and yourself, that's that messiness, that daring, that experiment is where the change happens. And I'm constantly coming up against my own limitations, but I'll constantly be holding my head up saying, I've misunderstood, I've assumed, I've got that bit wrong. Let's do a thought experiment together, especially with people that come and sit with me in therapy, that it just feels like, okay, so if there's no wrong and there's no right, I can just try. And there's something that, again, it comes back to that inquiry and generosity and just giving things a go, because we won't know or we won't even have anything different if we're not, trying to do something different.
Trying to reach.
Yeah.
Brené Brown says, I'm not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. And that's what you're talking about. It's about a kind of willingness to kind of have a test and go, is this what you're saying? Have I understood? Or can we kind of find some ground where we can work forward? Am I getting this right, without being attached to of nailing it first time? That actually what you're saying is that the outcome is something that we manufacture and knit in relationship with another, that we do that together. We build it back and forth.
Absolutely. The back and forth is the creative place, is the dynamic place. And I think that is experimented with in therapy. And I think that, having always had my own therapy for as long as I have been a therapist, I really understand that vulnerability is the place where you want to avoid, but it's the place where you do become more creative. You do challenge these things, that if that really is the worst thing that could happen to me, if that really is my biggest trigger, my worst nightmare, I can face that. And even though I don't like any of the choices that I've got in front of me, it isn't the death of me. It doesn't eradicate me. I can still move. I can still survive it. And I think that is, that vulnerability and that understanding and confronting the nightmare, because it will happen. The nightmare will happen at some point. It gives me a nice perspective to sit with other people and not have too many expectations to really know what it's like to say things for the first time.
That's really tender. That was beautiful. Thank you, Emma, so much.
No, thank you too. And it's been really nice talking to you today, and I hope to come on again and talk about other things. Double thumbs up.
Double thumbs up. Thank you so much. And if anybody who's listening wants to get in touch with either me or Emma, you can do so via my fan mail link, which is in the show notes. So have a look down in the show notes and you can send me a message. I won't be able to reply, but I will be able to either pass it on to Emma or maybe even include your comment in a future episode. Emma, you're also available on the counselling directory and the ACP directories. That's Emma McDermott, is that right?
Yes. And I work from the Angel Centre, which is based in Salford, for face-to-face appointments or online for people that are looking for therapy and can't get to the Angel Centre.
Lovely. Emma, thanks so much. See you soon.
Thank you, Nadine. Really nice talking to you today.
Thanks for being with us this episode. The B-side, which takes one aspect of this episode and digs a little deeper into how that might be explored in the therapy room, will drop very soon. In the meantime, if you'd like to have more of our conversations and metaphorical excavations, it would be grand for you and grand for us if you would subscribe to the podcast or share a favourite episode with a friend.